Weary. It's 4:35, and I hope we have most people back, but I do hope we can just launch into our policy roundtable. But let me just check to see if our policy roundtable members are with us. Hopefully we still have Megan and Laura, and just checking in. Sorry, my screen, I'm trying to make sure I can see everybody. Good, and we've got Siddharth and Bruce. So I'm not going to have you guys reintroduce yourself, partly for time, but if we could welcome our additional four members to the Policy Roundtable. Let me just start alphabetically. Tom Brownlee, you want to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, good afternoon. Tom Brownlee with
We can hear you. Oh, now we can't.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me take the earpiece out. I appreciate being here. Again, Tom Brownlee with Pfizer Policy, lead our state policy team. I've been with Pfizer for 15 years and happy to be part of the panel here today.
Great, thank you. Deborah Gann. Just, hi, introduce yourself if you can hear me. Oh, you're on mute. I want to make sure if the our moderators can help people unmute themselves if there's something you can do. Well, Deb, we will come back and ask the staff to see if they can work with you to make sure that you get on the audio here one way or the other. We also have Fernando Velayos. I hope I'm pronouncing your name close to correctly.
It is perfect. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sound check. Great. So my name is Fernando Velayos. So I, for 12 years, was at University of California at San Francisco as co-medical director of the IBD Center there, and more recently at Kaiser Permanente Northern California as a regional lead for inflammatory bowel disease.
Thank you. Welcome. And everybody can see the conflicts of interest up there. Some of them are relatively obvious if folks work for a stakeholder. And Pat Gleason.
Yes, hello. Pleasure to be here. Been at Prime Therapeutics 18 years, a health services researcher at Prime, and an adjunct faculty at the University of Minnesota College of Pharmacy.
Thanks for being with us. Deb, did we get you on audio yet? Oh, we're still working on it. I'm so sorry. Again, I know our staff can hear me. They're going to be working with you to try to see if we can figure out. You might want to try to call in on your phone to see if there's a separate way we can get you into the process. I'll save some special questions for Deb then. Okay, so we have too much to cover in less than an hour now. What I'd like to do is to turn it back away from the evidence, so to speak, and really kind of talk about the real world in the sense of coverage, pricing, and future research. Because there are a lot of kind of difficult questions to cover here, and we've already talked about some of them. But I want to start back from the patient perspective and say, right now today, what is the biggest failure on the coverage side? We'll get to pricing. What is the biggest failure that you face, in your view, on the coverage of these treatments for patients with ulcerative colitis? Laura, I bet you don't have an answer for that question.
I actually do have an answer, but I'm wondering if we should let Megan go first as our patient, and then I will chime in after Megan.
Absolutely.
I think that for patients, the biggest challenge or shortcoming is when the decision making is taken entirely out of our hands or the hands of ourselves and our relationship with our healthcare providers and into the hands of an insurance company, somebody sitting in an office who isn't in the conversation with us directly. When you are diagnosed with a chronic illness, a lifetime incurable illness, you lose so much control. So for us as patients, as particularly ulcerative colitis patients, literally that's sometimes losing control of your bowels, but it's also your time and your energy and your ability to, again, go after your goals of school, career, etc. So to lose another piece of control throughout your experience is just, it's like draining. It's absolutely soul-sucking to just do all of these things and then have it denied by somebody who does not know you more than a number.
Okay, thank you. Laura, how would you add to that?
Yeah, I'm going to stay on the topic of access, and really, I think if the providers weigh in, they're also going to share that access and the amount of time a patient spends navigating the insurance system, the healthcare provider and their team navigating to get access to the patient, it's prohibitive. It's not taking into account the guidelines that have been developed by the professional societies. Often formularies and step therapy protocols reflect how a disease is managed in arthritis rather than in inflammatory bowel disease. The formulary just doesn't reflect the guidelines that have been developed by our physician experts. And so step therapy is really the biggest pain point right now, but it's in the context of overall access being an issue for both our patients and our providers who are trying to get their patients well and back into a productive part of society.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go kind of quickly around on this point. Clinical experts, as you know, payers at P&T committees who are outside the payer, they convene P&T committees to basically make judgments about treatments. And they don't always do the step therapy part, but they have to be on board with the idea that treatments are being used appropriately. From a clinical perspective, is it true that there are really no biomarkers or any other things right now that we can use to say that this patient will respond best to a JAK inhibitor, this patient to an anti-TNF, this patient to an IL-23? We're still kind of shooting in the dark at the beginning, right?
Yes, absolutely true. There are no predictors of who's going to respond to which of these agents from the get-go, and even later. That's something we would all like, we just don't have it.
So conceptually, as a clinician, does it bother you that an insurer would say, well, in order to try to provide affordable coverage, since you can use any one of these first, I want you to use the cheapest one first? Is there any clinical concern with that being an approach, which is step therapy?
As a broad concept, if all treatments were equal, there would be no reason to object to that. But all patients are not equal. And there's so many circumstances that will be different for different patients, different risks offered by different drugs, different treatment advantages. And you heard from the patients that, and providers as well, that this should be shared decision-making, we feel, between the provider and the patient. There are some very special circumstances that would make us want to use one drug or another.
So it feels like we're driving towards some middle where on clinical grounds, it might not be easy to say which drug would be best for a patient, but there are other considerations that might make it highly desirable or preferable for a patient for a number of reasons. And I know that some of those words are highly open to interpretation, and so we're going to try to figure out how precise we can get. But I guess, Laura, back to you, I guess to press the point in one way, to bring in the price. So ustekinumab's net price after rebate in our report is cited as over $91,000 a year. Infliximab biosimilar, a little over $13,000 a year. Don't you want your insurer to get that $13,000 drug into the hands of as many patients as possible if it works for them?
Absolutely. So the foundation's been one of the first out of the gate educating the IBD community about biosimilars. And we are supportive of the use in biosimilars when the evidence supports that infliximab or an infliximab biosimilar is the right drug for that patient. And the patient and the provider have made that choice together. Absolutely. And we're not against step therapy in its entirety. There are absolute reasons why you would have guardrails around the use of medications. But as you were just saying, Steve, there have to be other considerations beyond cost that go into that decision making. And we want appropriate guardrails around how step therapy is utilized, including having access to the biosimilars and all therapies on the market so that the physician and the patient can make the right decision for them.
So I might come back to some of the specifics of it, because I know you guys have thought a lot about step therapy, and you probably have some do's and don'ts that we might kind of throw up on the wall and see what happens.
Sure.
But let me toss it over to the two folks. Deb, are you able to join us via audio now? Oh no, I'm sorry, you're still muted. What a shame. Okay, actually raise your hand. Have people reached out to you to try to help you get back on? Raise your hand if so. Okay. Well, we're still going to try. I don't know what, oh, you're on your, okay. But it's, okay. You can hear us, but can you speak? Go ahead and try using your phone. All right. Nobody else can hear her, right? It's not just me. Okay, we can't hear you, I'm afraid. So I'll come back. Okay, so Tom, it's all on you. Looking for your face around the Hollywood squares here. Okay, so you guys, obviously you're in an interesting position because you make a brand name and you make a biosimilar in this space, if you will. So tell us what's wrong with the current system and what could be fixed to help the uptake of biosimilars in appropriate settings, in which many people would say would be a lot of settings in which we have what is viewed as an equivalently effective drug that's much less expensive. Why can't we get it into the hands of more than what, I think 2% of patients? That's the penetrance of biosimilars in ulcerative colitis. What's going on and what could we do to fix that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think your percentage was correct there. Let me just back up and just make a couple comments on the step therapy piece, and I do think this links in. I think we reiterate sort of the statements that have been made by the patients around the challenges of step therapy. And I think one of the things that we're hearing here in this discussion that's really not coming to the forefront is step therapy as a concept under the broader umbrella of prior authorization, has its place. And we've worked on this issue for many years, advocating for a number of different policy changes. But I think the one unifying theme that we're hearing here is that there needs to be flexibility built within that system. And there needs to be an improved efficiency also, because I think one of the things that we don't often talk about is the trials and tribulations of simply moving through, 48 hours, 72 hours, weeks on end of trying to actually move through the process of a prior authorization. And we have the technology to make it better. We should do that. We should use electronic systems, et cetera. But at the end of the day, step therapy started as a clinical consideration of start low and go slow. And that's a decision that happens between a patient and their provider. And we still believe that that's really where it should come down to. So the policies are acceptable, but there needs to be sufficient flexibility built into those policies so that if a patient is not appropriate, as has been indicated in a lot of this discussion, that they aren't forced to go through that process. So I think that's just a couple of views where we have to sort of strike that balance. We understand cost containment is important, and all of the stakeholders recognize that. I know we recognize that and want to support efficient use of resources, but sometimes it's not efficient to move through that current process. So just to get that sort of on the table, from the biosimilars perspective, there's a ton of potential. There's investments are being made. The medicines are have proven to be helpful for patients. I think what we think about it is sort of the three dimensions of, at least, you have the patient, but you have to align also the providers as well. And then we have to figure out some of the financing pieces that are behind this. And, to start with the last two, I think making sure we don't have impediments to getting coverage, such as the rebate issues. I think everyone here would know and has heard about the challenges of when rebates are so big for the innovator that it really inhibits and disincentivizes the use of newer therapies, such as a biosimilar in this case. We need to address that through some sort of broader rebate type of reform. And then the other piece is the clinicians, and I assume that they can speak to this more directly, but making sure that the incentives are aligned for them so that they are not inhibited from using something that's lower cost or a biosimilar. So I think from our perspective, there's some penetrance in certain places. Some systems are already using biosimilars more actively, and we know some of the insurers are really taking great steps to try to figure out how to align all of those pieces, and we applaud them for that and think that's the right way to move forward.
Thanks. All right, so I'm going to go kind of quickly, and this may seem a little bit brusque. So I'm going to ask you one quick follow-up question. Why don't you guys price your drug 25% lower than infliximab? It's just a tad lower. Why not go for market share by going lower? Does the market not reward a lower price?
Well, as I mentioned, the market has the challenges of the rebate issues, and I will say that as more biosimilars come into a market, you see precipitous drop in ASP, and if you've tracked that, you can see that the competition actually really works in the biosimilar market once you get that additional competition into the market. So I hope that answers your question.
All right. So Fernando, enlighten us. Kaiser, somebody dropped me a note that said that Kaiser, at least Kaiser Colorado, is something like 90% use of biosimilars. Tell us how you've accomplished that. What would have been the lessons learned, good and bad?
So we're in Northern California. We're probably more in the mid 80%. But what I would say very briefly is that we had a very intentional approach and not a one size fits all. And so part of what we have, and one of the advantages in our system, is that there's a little bit of a closer connection with the physicians. And so the first thing we did is we looked at the data, then we educated our physicians, educated our patients, and we had kind of a structured approach. We did not pretend that this was going to happen overnight, or did we want to. The other thing we did to give reassurance is that we also, with our pharmacy colleagues, started to actually record. We actually said, okay, when we switch patients, what happens? And that would then feed back into our knowledge in terms of what is happening, so that if there was something, we would be able to capture it right away. And so the whole purpose here was really not the short game, but the long game, and to create confidence in our system so that when we do want to make major changes, that there is that confidence that we are doing the right thing by patients and by doctors.
So Fernando, that was moving patients from brand infliximab over to the biosimilar.
Yes.
Did you have any program to move patients from other treatments like adalimumab or others over to the infliximab biosimilar, or was it just within the biosimilar and the brand and the originator?
Correct. And going kind of on the scientific principle. So patients who are stable on other therapies, we would not consider switching them to a biosimilar just for that cost effect. So really here is the main question is, moving forward for patients who are new starts, kind of what is the best management? And that's something that we're kind of addressing now.
Okay. Bruce or Siddharth, Tom mentioned the payment aspects for clinicians. And again, we've heard in other areas like oncology where there's been real stress because there's a fair amount of money that oncologists make, because if they get a % on the average sales price, they are incentivized to use the more expensive medication sometimes. Does that also play out amongst gastroenterologists with ulcerative colitis?
No, I don't think so to a large degree. Most gastroenterologists don't have their own infusion center, aren't marking up the drug and profiting from it. Gastroenterologists, the business is primarily to do procedures. That's the profitable part of their business. While there are some who do have infusion centers, for the most part, I don't think that's the case.
Okay, Siddharth, any other comment on that?
I don't know the answer. I mean, as sitting in an academic center, it's the other people make the decisions regarding that part.
Okay. So Laura, I saw you nodding your head as Fernando was talking about moving people from an originator biologic over to the biosimilar. I assume that raises fewer, if maybe no, concerns in general for patients if done well with education and kind of maybe some time to sleep on it, or I'm not sure what, but what's your experience? And Megan, I don't mean to ignore you at all. You're in a different place of my screen from Laura, so I have to keep looking both places, but go ahead, Laura.
I think Dr. Vallejo's really explained it well in that if you educate your providers and you educate your patients and it is a discussion around the switch, then and the evidence supports the switch, then there should be no problem. And I think it's on the behalf of the foundation, we have to help patients understand the role of biosimilars, encourage them to have the discussion with their doctor. And also, I'd love to see the cost savings from biosimilars somehow reach the patient, because I do believe that if patients were part of receiving the cost adjustment, you would see a lot more patients walking in the door and asking their physicians about biosimilars. If they, because patients do look at price, and right now, the premiums are so high for patients, and these are expensive drugs. We all recognize that. And if the cost savings were hitting the patient, we might see a more rapid uptake of biosimilars.
Good. Thanks for mentioning that. We wanted to capture that in our policy recs as well. Deb, one last chance. Are you with us?
Can you hear?
Oh,
Yeah,
there
can
you
you
are.
hear?
Touchdown.
Yeah.
Yes.
I had planned on reserving that if you gave me a tough question, then all of a sudden.
Well, I was going to pose you a question you could raise your hand for. Do you think we should use more biosimilars in ulcerative colitis? I had a funny feeling you were going to raise your hand.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought, Laura, you made an excellent point. I mean, one of the things that I do is talk to employer benefit consultants and coalitions, employer coalitions, about benefit design change, because if we're going to create real change like we see in the small molecules, it has to translate to some benefit design change. There's also a lack of understanding by most employers around the medical benefit. It's somewhat of a black hole to them, and we're trying to educate them to ask the right questions so they can have the transparency.
Is there anything magical about interchangeability here, Deb? There have been some people who say, let's just give up trying to push biosimilars. It's really not working very well in the U.S. system until we can get them into interchangeable kind of approval modes. Then it's just not going to work. What's your view? Is there a policy recommendation that you would suggest we consider around the issue of interchangeability?
Yeah, I think you might be talking about hashtag throw in the towel that trended there for a little while on biosimilars. So we believe in the free market solution. So interchangeability will obviously bring about, more patients that could be available to the product. And as a result, you do see that market competition work. So, in Europe, they have successfully used interchangeability for a long time now. And it's why you see the success of the biosimilars in their market versus the U.S., along with a whole host of things. Tom had mentioned some of the misaligned incentives. There's also a lot of patent litigation that goes on. We have only 17 biosimilars in the market in the U.S., and you have 50, and we have 80 in the pipeline. So, hopeful as more of them enter into the marketplace, you'll have these greater understandings and adoptions and education that a lot of people have spoken to right here.
Great, thank you. Pat, I think you're the last one to get a shot at this. You've probably been wanting to say a whole bunch. I have a question for you, and you can take it first or second or whatever. I'm looking at this table that was in our report. And sorry, you're not looking at it either, but it was based out of research it's a database called SPEC, and it includes coverage policies across 17 of the largest health plans in the United States. And in that database, looking at ulcerative colitis, adalimumab had the lowest percent across all of these agents of having its coverage policy be narrower than the FDA label. So it had the lowest chance of having a narrower label. It had the lowest chance of requiring step therapy before getting to it, whereas the infliximab biosimilars had the highest. They were the highest risk, if you will, among all of these treatments of requiring step therapy to get to them. To get to a biosimilar, you would have to step through something else. What's wrong with that? And how does this happen? Because you're in the room when these things, to a certain extent, are being negotiated. What's going on? And does it have anything to do with interchangeability or kind of other things?
Maybe other things, I'm not sure. Let me just start though before maybe I'll address the question hopefully along the way, but I do need to point out as owned by 18 Blues plans, servicing 23, servicing tens of millions of Americans with their pharmacy benefits on behalf of the Blues plans at Prime Therapeutics. That looking at 15 million commercially insured lives that I have access to with longitudinal data, 0.6% of the population is using a TIM for one of the many indications for which they have. So we're talking about rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel diseases, psoriasis, ankylosing spondylitis, all the conditions, 0.6%, so 6 per thousand. And about 10% of those are for ulcerative colitis, so 6 per 10,000.
Right.
18.4% of all drug spend for every drug processed through the medical and pharmacy benefit is to pay for TIMS. I'll say that again. 18.4% of all expenditures for every drug, all antibiotics, cystic fibrosis, every drug, almost $1 in $5 is to spend for TIMS for 6 per thousand insured individuals, commercially insured in the Blues that we service. So there's disproportionate expenditures for all of healthcare drug expenditures for the TIMS, to the tune that the top 3 drugs processed through the pharmacy benefit are TIMS in the payments that we're making directly to the pharmacies at the cost that they're charging us with our discounts to the pharmacies. You layer in the discounts that are in your report, they're still the top 3, above any cancer drug, above any HIV drug. They are still, TIMS, the top 3 drugs. I'll give you a 50% discount. If we could obtain that, would be super. They'd still be the top 3. And the number 1 drug on the medical benefit is Remicade in expenditures. So in order to try to control those costs, because we need to pay for all drugs and ensure that you all have coverage for all drugs. And you tell great stories, Steve's, and from our patients, couldn't agree more with the challenges of healthcare and to insure people with their health insurance. We're trying to get the biggest discounts we can to cover all drugs. And I'll just end with, there are coupons for every one of these drugs for commercially insured individuals that will completely cover their deductibles and their out-of-pocket costs, because the coupons are valued at $10,000 to $20,000.
So Pat, what do you think? Thank you. And I was going to ask you, because I do know employers come in all the time saying, do something about this, right? Get tougher, do something about it. And in the marketplace, there are going to be other PBMs or other health plans that are going to do tougher, whatever tougher looks like. And that's what the market does. It puts the patient in the middle of this to a certain extent by looking for savings from tougher utilization management.
It does, and yeah, and the prior auth itself is to ensure that the drug is being used for the condition in which it is appropriate. I mean, so we frequently see prior auth requests from physicians trying to prescribe these products in an off-label, unsubstantiated manner. So that first step, and I couldn't, be more sympathetic to the patient that has to deal with that step just to ensure that the drug's being used correctly. And we wish it was simpler. And to Tom's point, it is faster, and we can continue to build out more electronic processing to make that be as fast as possible. But when a drug is $50,000, $100,000 a year, we have to make sure it's being used for the condition in which it should be used. And then for the step, to your point on Humira, it's a challenging bundle that you have to look at for its utilization across its many indications.
Right. And this gets back to what Laura, I think, referred to. Thank you, Pat. And we'll come back to the pricing aspects of that. But Laura, you mentioned how the clinical guidelines don't seem to match up with the step therapy sometimes. And you've heard from Pat, and I know you know this already, but I think what happens is that when they bundle these rebates across all the indications, The only way they can get the lowest price is if they say you get to be number one everywhere, even if in that indication it somehow doesn't seem to be right. Is that a fair description of what you see?
I don't want to speak on behalf of Pat, and I'm not an insurance expert, but what I will say to that is we have patients call us all the time, and docs call the foundation all the time, trying to get through the prior authorization process. And there are drugs on formulary, and I've seen these formularies that are not even indicated for IBD, that are approved in other disease states that patients are being asked to step through. And I would love to see us work more closely with our insurance partners to make sure the formulary guidelines are, match the professional society guidance, and that we have more communication. And again, I come back to the need for more research in this area and more use of real world evidence, working with our doctors and sharing that evidence with insurers on how to use these drugs. And I know we're not there yet, but we're working towards treat to target. And so I just think we need more communication between insurers, our professional society, patient societies, so we can get the protocols that, everyone's concerned about cost, but it can't be at the sake of a patient not getting access, because when you delay treatment, you worsen outcomes in IBD, and that leads to more expense, where if we can get patients on the right treatment earlier, we can reduce that expense.
It's always hard when we have these meetings because, as you all know, you can look at step therapy as a concept. You can look at it as it's written down, and then you can experience it as it happens between clinicians and patients and insurers. And the three sometimes don't always line up. Something can look right on paper but not be administered well, in which case, in a sense, it doesn't do anybody any good if it's not administered well. And by administered, I mean things like the ability of clinicians to rapidly seek an exception for kind of a clear rationale, to have that information go quickly to the insurer or PBM and to come back in a way that is reliable. Those kinds of systems are something that people have talked about for a long time. So I have to be sensitive to the time, and what I'd like to suggest, because we still need to talk about pricing, I think, more, but I also know that we want to talk a little bit more about the translation of the FDA label into the prior auth, because I think that's not even really step therapy, although some people would view a piece of it as step therapy. Let me just read the FDA label. And I can't remember which of the TIMs I took this from, but I think they're probably all the same. It's indicated for moderate to severely active disease, patients with moderate to severely active disease who have had an inadequate response to conventional therapy. That's the FDA language. So now you're an insurer. Almost every single one of those words is open to interpretation. What's moderate to severely active disease? What's an inadequate response? And what's conventional therapy? So I'm sure that this does get interpreted in so many different ways. I'd love to know how we could frame something that sounds like what a good approach is. I hesitate to call it best practice, but what's a good approach to looking at an FDA label like that and saying, okay, I mean, obviously one option is just to say, let a doctor tick a box. This is moderate to actively severe disease, and this patient has inadequately responded to conventional therapy. Tick the box and we're done. The other extreme is probably, minute numbers attached to each one of these different words. Let me start with Pat and maybe Fernando, if you've been involved in this kind of thing too. But what do you think is a best practice when a P&T committee or you would turn that into prior auth language and administer it?
Yeah, and I'll just quickly say that it happens, what ends up happening is you end up going to the RCT trial and looking at the inclusion-exclusion criteria. That's typically how it's done. What would be better, in my opinion, would be if the professional societies would get together, the gastroenterology societies, instead of being separate, and come up with one guideline to give us guidance, like the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, and a third they all got together and gave us guidance for heart failure. So if they could get together and give us guidance, we would follow it.
So would that guidance look like, for instance, moderate to severely active disease? I've seen some coverage policy for psoriasis that specifies that's 10% of your body. That's moderate to severely active. Other plans do it differently. Clinical experts, do you think the clinical societies could go back and come up with something that's clearer than moderate to severely active disease, inadequate response to conventional therapy that would help the insurers be more consistent?
It probably could. They would have to decide to work with each other first rather than compete with each other to offer the same guidelines. Right now, we do have largely overlapping guidelines, but not identical. But we're talking about defining disease populations based on severity. And severity itself is a concept that seems to talk about the patient at the moment that they're confronting the physician, but in reality is a trajectory of disease that has to be accounted for. And that's what we really struggle with. It's all the prior treatments. It's, yes, how symptomatic they are at that moment as well. And finally, there is a lot of difficulty in translating clinical trial enrollment criteria to clinical practice simply because the clinical trials rely on disease activity measures that are not routinely performed in clinical practice. And so we can't give you we cannot give you a Mayo score for most patients in average practice. Maybe a little different in academic practice, but those are the minority of patients.
All right, so sensitive to the time again, and apologies, I would run this differently if we had more time. Let's try, because when we put out our final report, we don't actually recommend formally, this is how it should be covered or shouldn't be covered. We try to present perspectives on different approaches, like perspectives on step therapy, pros and cons, just considerations that people might not be aware of. In this kind of area though, people do appreciate it if we can give some examples of approaches. So, and Pat, maybe you know this if you've looked at your own coverage policy, maybe you don't, but like what is the right, I mean, is there a best practice as to right now defining moderate to severely active disease? That's the first part of the FDA label. When you put that into insurance prior auth, do you just let the clinician tick the box, or is there a way that you think it's best practice? Again, you said you could use the RCTs, in which I can't remember whether they required a certain Mayo score. It probably was a Mayo score, but as you've heard, nobody uses that in clinical practice. So what do you do?
Yeah, I wish I could give you an answer there, Steve. I'm not that close to the development of that policies.
Okay. Any of the clinicians happen to have awareness of how insurers have done this, and do you view a best practice there? No? Okay.
I think from a severity standpoint, again, while we think about, moderate to severely active disease, it's always a challenge. I mean, is it the first course of steroid that defines somebody as having moderate to severely active longitudinal trajectory? Is it the second course? When do you define that? And so I think that's where each individual person sort of comes in. If I need steroids once every 5 years, maybe I don't need to go on a biologic right up front. Maybe I can manage with mesalamine, but if I definitely need more than one course of steroids in a year, or every 2 years, then that's somebody that I probably should be thinking about, even though on steroids, their disease activity is not going to be moderate to severely active. So I think it varies. I think people have tried to do it. We're trying to move into who's at high risk for colectomy versus not. And there are some criteria that go around it in helping define the moderate to severely active disease.
One thing that I might add from the patient perspective is patients don't necessarily want to be on TIMS unless they really need them. They're not asking to be on TIMS. They would much rather be on conventional therapy if it's working. And so the approach that the doctor is asking for it because the patient is moderate to severe generally is accurate in my view. But what we get is a variety of implementation where for some insurers, our say-so is enough, and for others, there are all kinds of barriers of evidence and proof that have to be provided and often looked at by unqualified people when they're reviewing the medical data, unfortunately.
Yeah. To add on to Dr. Sands' comment, I think for this part of it, I think that we would have to assume that physicians are overusing these medications, are over-treating very mild disease. And I think to Dr. Sands' point, I think it's usually the thought is that it may actually be the opposite, that we're intervening perhaps when it's a little bit too late. But I do agree with Pat, though, that I think as the specificity though will help, particularly, as we are really talking about how to streamline the process. So I think those things should be encouraged.
Okay, good. I wish we had more time to drill down into, I know inadequate response are usually fighting words between clinicians and patients and insurers, as is conventional therapy. So I imagine that there may be some insurers who require certain trials of conventional therapy that some clinicians might not want to. I assume they're taking them from some guideline, but maybe we can get into some of those, some details in our final report. So briefly, I want to shift to pricing before we talk about future research, and then make sure that we can close up by 5:30 Eastern. The pricing, I have to say, it's disheartening when you look at a table of all of the different prices, and even with the net prices, they're still pretty far away, except for the biosimilars and infliximab, from where, again, if we're trying to find that sweet spot where we can make sure that we have enough incentives for good innovation, but not blow things so that we have adequate resources for everything to stay affordable. But there's a glimmer of hope with the biosimilars, because it's interesting, with 2 of them in the mix, the prices for infliximab have come way down just in the last couple of years. So just if you had to give one recommendation that we could put on kind of amplify, Pat, on what could help you negotiate or in some way, or you think the system overall could advance towards more cost-effective prices, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it would be if we could get discounts that are in alignment to value of Eiser, and then on our end, we have the responsibility of delivering an indication-based formulary, so that the drugs that are preferred for formulary status, and potentially to Dr. Sand's point and others, patients in particular, then eliminate the step therapy barriers by having the formulary be aligned to the indication. There are many challenges there, but we continue to strive for that at Prime, and you have to integrate medical and pharmacy data to make that happen. So you have to have integrated benefits and not standalone pharmacy benefits.
So just to be clear, you feel like you could blow up the bundled rebates that are being used to try to get some lower prices if you had a different mechanism to keep the prices aligned to a cost effectiveness range, then you could loosen up on step therapy. I interpret you correctly?
Yeah, and I would say that also we would need to leverage the coupon. So, I mean, the coupon sits out there as a discount that's offered at $10,000 to $20,000 off of the price, available to the patient. It's commercially insured. It's frequently not optimized, but it sits out there. So why not optimize it? And in particular, if you're going to be on the formulary and the preferred status, then we would anticipate optimizing that discount, getting you much closer to the Eiser value in your report.
Great. One last question for you all, and then I want to invite you to have a last comment. We heard earlier, and Laura, you commented on it too, I think, to a certain extent, but we heard that there's a real mismatch between the burden of illness in minority communities of ulcerative colitis and the information we have from clinical trials on outcomes, relative outcomes, and other features. What can we do as a system of all the different stakeholders, hopefully working together on this? What could we do to improve that situation? Is it registries? Is it something upstream with the FDA and the manufacturers? What would be the 2 or 3 most important things we could do to solve that problem? Anybody? Laura, go ahead.
I think it's a combination of things, honestly, Steve. I think, we need to understand the impact on these communities. So more research to understand the experience of inflammatory bowel disease in an African-American community versus an Asian population versus a Latinx. But we also then need to, once we understand the disease and the health disparities that may be impacting them, then we need policy and education initiatives that are aligned to those communities, that are culturally relevant, to those communities to support their engagement. And then ultimately, we need to get more of these populations engaged with research so that we do know which drugs are most effective for their unique disease states.
I would also add, and Annette brought this up earlier, it's the horrifying thought that people would feel financially pushed into a clinical choice that they might not want, colectomy in this case. That if their insurance coverage is such that that's a much lower out of pocket, that the fact that that would weigh heavily in their thinking it's more than an embarrassment. It's a real guilt that we should all bear in trying to figure out a better way forward. Anybody else have a quick thought on that? Anything else? Because Laura, that was great. Anything else? Okay. Being sensitive to everybody's time, I do want to invite the policy roundtable to have a last comment, if you will. If you can be really short by keeping it just to a sentence, we often invite folks to just make sure that you get a chance to frame the most important thing that you want this panel and obviously the broader set of folks who read our final reports and watch these webinars to remember. It could be a request of any of the other stakeholders around the policy roundtable, if there's something they could do to make the world a better place tomorrow. And we're going to let the patients go last to give them a little bit more time to think about it. So please be very, very brief. And can I start back with the manufacturers, Tom, can I ask you to start, please?
Sure, yeah, happy to leave you with a final thought, appreciate it. I think we've covered a lot of issues. I think the thing that really has not been discussed here today, and that I would hope that everyone here continues to think about and work as hard on this issue as we are working on other value issues, is the benefit design issues. Copay cards were discussed on several occasions. These are really just a Band-Aid fix for a structural challenge that we're not dealing with. We know that there are benefit designs that can help patients access all types of medicines without impacting actual medical cost. States have done it. It's done it through standardized designs, through various mechanisms, and you can see the same actuarial value with different designs with very minimal changes to the drug design. Really want to encourage everyone to really give deep thought to that, because underlying all of this out-of-pocket cost for patients is what they pay at the pharmacy, is what determines whether they often get the medicine. So just like to leave that with the group.
Thank you. Deb, apologies again that you didn't get in earlier, but please let's know your last thought here.
Yeah, my last thought is regarding ACA. So folks might not be familiar, but the ACA was the vehicle for the approvals for the biosimilar pathway. It goes up for review at the Supreme Court, we know, on November 10th. So depending on the outcome of whether the ACA is going to be considered unconstitutional, I think we've got to plead with our politicians to have some kind of continuation of the biosimilars, because of the great savings they can provide to the healthcare industry as well as to patients. So, again, I'm a little worried about the future of biosimilars from the political angle.
All right. Thank you very much. Clinical experts, if I can ask you to go next. Siddharth.
Yeah, so again, while step therapy is clearly a challenge, I think there is still some scope for mass personalization, so that something like the best or the most effective medication for the vast majority of people is still easily accessible, just to improve access, so the vast majority of people can get access to that. And then you layer in the additional nuances for each individual patient. But I think the goal is to make sure that all patients are able to access these therapies.
Okay, thank you very much. And Bruce?
Right, I just want to once again highlight the heterogeneity of the patients that we see, and we all wish that we had medications with absolutely earth-shattering, ground-breaking efficacy. You see that they are all in a way similar in all respects. The efficacy of all these agents are at a plateau that we are unable to overcome, and really without predictive biomarkers, we really need all of these medications accessible to our patients if we're going to provide the best care for the totality of the population.
Thanks. You guys are crafting very nice sentences. Appreciate it. Fernando.
I guess having the advantage of being, I guess, possibly on both sides of this, having seen on both sides that I would say that physicians and patients, I think, do get the concept of cost. They understand that these medications are expensive. On the other hand, cost is actually, has the possibility of providing kind of an existential threat for providing access. And so I think really somewhere between one size fits all and no size fits all, there is actually a lot of ground where we can kind of work together. And really what we're talking about is that streamlining that process. And then perhaps instead of thinking of things like step care, maybe thinking of things like a portfolio or diversity of a basket of things that you do have access to, whether it's diversity in the microbiome for ulcerative colitis. The question here is that you don't want one thing to overgrow and affect the rest. And so there is a certain health in actually having a portfolio approach. And perhaps the thing is that once you start to get outside that mix, that's perhaps where you get extra scrutiny. And I think that would give you the flexibility for that specific case or the heterogeneity of patients while still keeping those guardrails, which are still important for kind of providing access for everyone.
Great, thank you. Pat.
Yeah, I'd ask all to look at the price to quality that is in this report compared to others, and then just determine whether that the value is there for these products at those prices. I'll just add, you remove the capabilities of step therapy and formulary, and you won't have the discounts that are in the report right now. You'll be paying whack price.
All right. Thank you. All right, and into the home stretch. Laura? Oops, you're on mute.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone's comments so far. I really have 3 points. I would encourage Eiser to ensure that your report it protects access and physician and patients' decision making, that you help us to address step therapy and the issues that it causes for our patients and providers around access, that we encourage cost savings to be passed on to patients. So as we bring costs down and entry of biosimilars, that we really pass those savings on to patients. And then lastly, we really encourage more real world evidence being incorporated into these decisions so that not just the clinical experience of the patients take into account, but how these drugs and how the patient's experience of these drugs are actually used in everyday life, and do more research with real world evidence.
Thank you very much. Megan, final words.
Pressure's on. I would ask this group to always keep the patient experience at the forefront, because we are not numbers. For us, this is our entire lives, and we are living with a disease that we did not ask for. We did not do anything to get. And really all we want is to get back to our normal lives and be able to honestly forget that we have a chronic disease. And so what that means to us is being able to get, in a perfect world, just get the right treatment for us so that we can reach remission and have some relief. And right now, as all have said, there's a lot of barriers to that, including price sensitivity, high prices, step therapy, access to care, even information, all of that things as a patient who is sick, who is tired, who is weak, who now has to waddle through all of that. I think we can all do better. And for me, it's the difference between laying on the couch every day and going into my job and being productive, laying on the couch, eating white bread, white rice, or going out for a run and eating a salad. And it's just so much more than the numbers. It's incredible people's livelihoods.
Thank you very much. Really, from my perspective, on behalf of Eiser, and I know on behalf of CTAF as well, I'd really like to thank all of you guys for a fantastic, kind of very focused conversation. My apologies again, when we do it live, I kind of wander around like some crazed Phil Donahue figure, and you guys get to see each other and get all the body language. So thank you for putting up with the technology limitations and somewhat with the time limitations that were kind of linked to that. Let me hand it back over to the chair of CTAF. We usually have time to go around for everybody on the CTAF to also have a final word, but I don't think we're going to have time for that today. So I'd like to invite Paul to perhaps have a final word, and then I will have one last final party after that. Paul?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think it has been an incredible day of testimony, hearing the wide variety of patient experience. I think we're fortunate in some ways to have so many medications and treatments available, yet surprisingly with so little head-to-head data. And the one thing I took away from this is the need for much more and better information on which drug, which treatment is best for which patient.
Thanks. Yep, I'm going to break my own rule and have just a tiny bit longer reflection, just because I know I'm going to sum up some other feelings that people have had, but it really starts with that. Everything builds off of what we can learn from these treatments about their comparative clinical effectiveness. When we start to talk about value, it is that, if you will, that first floor of the pagoda. And we were particularly limited in this situation. We need more head-to-head trials. We need more sequential trials where we can study this drug and that drug versus this drug and another drug. Something more to help clinicians and patients. And ultimately, I was, though, left very optimistic, because Laura and Megan and the others who came to speak, I got the sense that you guys, not only are you experiencing the problems, the barriers to care, you understand the ecosystem in which you want, and everybody wants, innovation, but you know that price is part of the access, issue that we're all facing. And if we don't start to look at the broader policies, that it can improve competition, but when there's not really adequate competition in some way, somehow keep the prices in a way that this doesn't become the bullseye. As you heard from Pat, this is the bullseye because prices and use are high and the prices are going up. So it's makes it for a very uncomfortable and unfortunate situation. So the whole group, all of us, have a lot to ask of each other, but it starts with the kind of respect that you folks on the Policy Roundtable show to each other and to everybody else throughout the course of the day. So again, I want to thank you for all of that. Eiser will be turning around a final report that includes a distillation of this conversation with some policy perspectives and some and recapitulation of the votes. And that will be up on our website, usually within, there it is, it looks around about 3 weeks from now. But this is just the beginning of this conversation. I'm sure in this space there'll be more innovation. There will probably be more stress around coverage and pricing. So I wouldn't be surprised if we come back and have the chance to talk about it again. And I hope that we do find the costs and the access in a better place. I hope we find our country in a better place. But the quality of this deliberation and the discourse that we've had today gives me a lot of hope. So thank you very much to everybody. I would usually say travel safe, but on your way back to your kitchen, don't trip, and otherwise have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.